Chinese see this as the third opium war. This is the third opium war. This is an attempt by the United States to bring China back into the century of humiliation. They will not surrender. They will continue to develop their new productive forces, and they will defend themselves. They will defend themselves. They are not going to surrender. There is no Gorbachev in China. United States has looked for a long time for a Gorbachev in Beijing. They are not going to show up. They don't exist there. The party is extremely careful about all that nonsense. It's not going to happen.
大家好，欢迎来到正经脉动。今天想跟大家介绍一位非常特别的思想者，来自印度的历史学家、作家、政治评论员维杰·普拉萨德。他长期以鲜明的反帝立场和全球南方的独特视角闻名国际。现在这个世界局势纷繁复杂，他的声音提供了一个跳出西方主流叙事，重新观察全球问题的窗口。今天我们选取的是他最近一次演讲的精华片段。在这段演讲和随后的问答中，普拉萨德火力全开，系统驳斥了西方社会对中国在人权、民主等问题上的常见的误解和偏见。他引用了大量民调和现实数据，为中国模式的合理性和人民的认可度提供了有力的支撑。同时，他也直言不讳地批评了像澳大利亚这样的国家在外交上缺乏独立性，盲目跟随美国的反华立场。他还分析了特朗普政府对华政策的转向，以及美国在科技、社会、国家心态等方面所面临的深层挑战。那普拉萨德是如何一步步拆解西方对中国的刻板印象的呢？他又怎么看中美之间科技实力的消长呢？面对观众提出的白人至上和澳洲奴性心态等尖锐问题，他又是如何回应的呢？接下来就让我们一起来听听维杰·普拉萨德的这段精彩演说。
Chinese cities, there are cameras everywhere. And I don't have a problem with that because guess what? There is no crime as a consequence. People will tell you that. Women walk late at night by themselves, totally unafraid. There is no harassment, no crime. There's cameras everywhere. So privacy advocates, I understand. You're living in an imperialist country, you worry that the camera's following you. That if you're going to a meeting, they are, seeing where you're going and so on. In this case, what most people say is that they are made safe by the cameras. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of what I mean. There was a study done by a group from the right, a right-wing think tank in Europe. One of the board members of this right-wing think tank is Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former General Secretary of NATO, not a man of the left, not even a liberal, really. And the research institute is not a liberal research institute. It's one of these democracy institutes that believes that democracy is effectively what you see in the West and everybody else is totalitarian. Well, this institute conducted mass surveys around the world of what people think of as democracy. And they asked people in the United States, in European countries, Australia, they asked the Chinese, what do you think of democracy? And a series of associated questions. The survey was published about a month ago. In the United States, tellingly, about 50% of those surveyed said that they don't live in a democracy, about 50%. I think that's a pretty fair number because both the Democrats and the Republicans have been maligning the electoral system. People just don't feel like they live in a democracy because in the United States, democracy means the elections. And people just don't feel like the electoral system, both from the right and from the centrist liberals, they don't feel like the system works for them. So 50% of the people, roughly, said we don't live in a democracy. Now, they asked the Chinese. If you read the New York Times or you read the Murdoch press in Australia or I don't know, anywhere around these sort of settler colonial countries, you'll discover that China is fundamentally an authoritarian country, if you read this sort of press. But if you talk to the Chinese, as this survey did, they came up with a very interesting finding. Because of the Chinese that they surveyed, 80% said they lived in a democracy. And this might be a surprise to lots of people, that 80% of the Chinese think they live in a democracy. If you talk to real living Chinese people, and not just a phantom of the Chinese. China is going to invade Australia. If you talk to real Chinese people, they will tell you they feel free in their country. They can walk around as they walk the streets of the major cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, Chongqing. You go into the interior. There are no poor people because they've abolished absolute poverty. In Sydney, you walk around, there are homeless people. There are no homeless people in China. You don't feel, lessened as a human being having to walk around a person without pants who sleeps on the street, which damages your sense of being a human being. This is not an experience in China. Plus, they do have elections at the local level, but by and large, they don't think of elections as a good way to define democracy. They think democracy means they live in a society where they are reasonably happy. There was a survey done by Harvard University Press which asked the Chinese people, are you happy with your government? And close to 90% of people said that they are happy with their form of government and with the current government of Xi Jinping. Tell that to the Australian press. Because all of this, or whatever the title was, about AUKUS and so on, all of that is about a phantom called China. All of that. If you don't deal with the phantom called China, none of this makes sense. It's all about a place called China which doesn't exist on the planet Earth. There is no China which is the referent to which Anthony Albanese and the press refers. The China that they are talking about does not exist in the world. China does not want to invade Australia. Just to be very clear. They don't even want to invade the Philippines. They have no interest in invading Japan. They don't want to attack India. That's not their understanding of the next 100 years. They are pledged to what Deng Xiaoping called peace and development. With peace comes development. Development means building cities like Shenyang, 3-level city, pioneering high-speed rail. They are not interested in getting into a war with the madcap United States, which can destroy entire cities in an afternoon, as they did to Baghdad, for instance, or they did to Tripoli. They don't want some mid-level nuclear missile to be fired, or from Tyndall Air Base, a nuclear bomber to take off and drop a bomb on Beijing. They don't want that. They are quite pragmatic. They understand that going to war with Australia, or Australia, a country of 27 million people, it's about the size of Beijing. I was asking Nick earlier, what if I gave Australians a survey and asked them, hey, listen, how many people live in Australia? I think they would imagine that Australia has a much higher population. I think they might be surprised to hear that the population is basically Greater Calcutta, where I was born. I think they might be surprised. And really, if you cut the western part of the country off, which they tried to do some decades ago, right? The Western Australia Freedom Movement, or whatever it was called, yeah? It's a much poorer country than it imagines, because all the wealth is over there. Or not all the wealth, but a lot of the wealth is over there. And if you pursue this course of AUKUS and anti-China, and the United States actually decides in a madcap way to assault China, which I really don't think they're going to do, but if they are crazy enough to do that, because of the AUKUS treaty and the Treaty of San Francisco and this treaty and that treaty, Tyndall is a target, Perth is a target, Pine Gap is a target. If you have more submarine manufacturing plants near Sydney, that's a target. They don't want to attack Australia, but if Australia has Tyndall and will launch a nuclear weapon carrying bomber from Tyndall, Tyndall's a target. Pine Gap is definitely a target and has been a target since the Cold War. Nobody is interested in Australia, guys. The Soviets there was no Soviet plan to invade Australia. Nobody was interested. Why did you build Pine Gap? It's useless for Australia. It's useless. Did you know, for instance, that Sydney is further from Beijing than Beijing is from Berlin? Berlin is closer to Beijing than Sydney is to Beijing. I mean, Australia is so far away from China that you have nothing to worry about. Some little dinky warships circumnavigate Australia and you have an absolute fit in the country. 4 or 3 warships are going to come in and invade. Are you crazy? I mean, you have US military all over, crawling around this continent. Crawling. We don't even know where they are. Because the Australian government says everything's secret. Rachel, you get elected to wherever the hell you're getting elected, they're not going to share a thing with you because you'll be a security risk. Elected officials are deemed security risk. We met Clinton Fernandez, one of the most brilliant Australians. He says, it's insane. This whole project is insane. Okay? I just want you to think about this again. How many of you knew that Berlin is closer to Beijing than Sydney? One person. Geography is interesting. It's really fascinating. And the thing is that given Trump, and I'm going to come back to Trump at some length in a minute, you have all these ex-Australian right-wing people coming out now against AUKUS. You got to be very careful. Malcolm Turnbull, Paul Keating, Bob Carr, your former foreign minister, all ex, by the way, all ex, come out against AUKUS, but not really against the US domination of Australian foreign policy. Not really against the US domination of Australian foreign policy, because Bob Carr's statement is important. He said that AUKUS is I'm quoting him now, okay? He said, AUKUS is a colossal surrender of Australian sovereignty. AUKUS is a colossal surrender of Australian sovereignty. AUKUS is a colossal surrender. It's not that Australia, since 1951, has surrendered its sovereignty to the United States. That's the more accurate statement. Neither Turnbull nor Keating nor Carr, in their very strong critiques of AUKUS, and I'm very glad to see these, these men of the right come out publicly and denounce AUKUS. 360 billion Australian and perhaps more, yeah? Huge amount of money. Sounds so much more in Australian dollars, which is the way to say it. To translate it into US dollars makes no sense. 360 billion Australian dollars. So much money. And probably that's a deflated number. Yeah? Keating, Turnbull, Carr, they're out there against AUKUS. Good for them. Writing, talking. I heard Turnbull, he's a funny guy on a podcast. He's a really funny guy. Yeah? Making some really funny statements. But it's really interesting. All these guys, when they're in government, they don't say anything. They don't resign. Nobody from Albanese's government of any high rank is going to resign on this. They don't make dissident statements and then wait to be fired. Because that's really courage. This is not really courage. I mean, to have Paul Keating make a statement is almost like an old guy needing relevance. But I'm glad they're out there against AUKUS. But I want you to understand that they are also misleading you, because they're focusing attention on AUKUS and not on the architecture of the Australian surrender of its sovereignty to the United States. A colossal surrender of sovereignty. You don't have a foreign policy. And I think you need to have one. Make Australia great again. Have your own foreign policy. Stand up and speak for yourselves. You used to have ungreat Britain speak for you. and then the United States. There's not been a moment in Australian history after the colony. There's not been a moment in your history when you've had an independent foreign policy. And I got this from Clinton Fernandez's book, which shows decisively Australia's interventions against its own interests time after time. Was it really necessary? And I know I'm just treading on some extremely sensitive nationalist toes. Was it necessary to go and fight in Gallipoli? What national interest did that serve for Australia? What national interest did it serve for Australian troops to fight in the Malaya emergency? Brutal, brutal war. Why did Australia have to fight against the Vietnamese liberation movement? Why did those soldiers go there? Why did they fight in Korea? What were they doing there? They don't speak Korean. What were they doing in Indonesia? What were they doing in East Timor? Intelligence officers and others, special forces, fighting on behalf of the Indonesians against the East Timorese. What independent foreign policy has Australia had? That's the question I wish Keating, Malcolm, Bob Carr, I wish they asked that question, but they don't, because they defend the status quo, the long-term status quo. What they ask you to be against is AUKUS, because they know there's a national consensus about Trump. And they know that the 10% plus 25% tariff is going to hurt Australia, so it's convenient to make this about Trump. But this is not about Trump and AUKUS. That's just the phenomena on the surface. Underneath the surface is US imperialism and the Australian subordination to it. Australia being a subordinate ally to the United States. What does Albanese say about the 10% plus 25% tariff? Oh, this is not how you treat friends. Really? That's as good as you can get. It's a 35% tariff on some parts of the Australian economy, because 25% would be on steel and so on, and the 10% is the blanket tariff. This is not how you treat friends. I mean, can you imagine being Albanese's friend? Like, what does he mean by that? Like, you know, even to say that shows how desperately servile these people are to US imperialism. Desperately servile. Why can't he even come out at this time of consensus in this country against Trump? Why can't he come out and say this is outrageous? This is outrageous. Although I must say, at one level, I don't really care. Because there's something bizarre about the debate. US-Australian trade, if you look at the figures, are minuscule. I know it's the third biggest trading partner. But your largest trading partner is the People's Republic of China, about 30% trade either way. And by the way, Australian trade with China is different from US trade with China. Australia is a surplus collecting country on the trade, not a deficit producing country. $100 billion surplus against China, because your raw materials which you export to China earn much more than the plastic buckets you import from China and Huawei phones, but you banned most of the high value goods. So you end up just with the plastic buckets. You can't get, for instance, the Idea Hub smart board, which, you know, it would have helped Dennis a lot. Because that Idea Hub smart board, you write with your fingers and you can move easily and you snap your finger and it does what you want. It's incredible. I mean, this is 18th century. It's not your fault, Dennis. It's ridiculous. Who uses this and that? What is that? That's like the rotary telephone. You know, now in China, you go to some workers, you know, commune in rural areas, and they have the Idea Hub smart board, which you just move pages with your hand and you write with a pen, and it's glorious. Or you can write on a smart phone and it shows up on, and the resolution changes from the phone, resolution or the space. It brings it to the screen and it changes. It takes your handwriting and makes it print. It's gorgeous, but you can't import that into Australia because it's banned technology, it's Huawei. Yeah, it's not allowed. There's something stupid, really, about this because US-Australia trade has been declining pretty fast over the last 25 years. You can see the graph. It's a real decline. And there's something to that you need to look at. All right. Trump. They are focused on Trump. They are focused on AUKUS. But we need to understand what Trump is doing. I don't think there's an adequate assessment of why Mr. Trump is behaving the way he is. So I want to share with you some of the underlying shifts going on in Washington so you can better understand why the United States is behaving in this way. It's not that Trump is crazy and irrational and so on. This is a very shallow analysis. In fact, there's an interesting shift that's taking place that I think comrades need to register. Don't repeat the bourgeois formulation that he is an aberration, that Biden was rational and Trump is irrational and so on. This is a bourgeois formulation. It's not accurate at all. Okay. What's interesting is, from the collapse of the USSR until this second Trump administration, US foreign policy was dominated by effectively right-wing idealists. These were people, and if you don't know what an idealist is, US political science, when it studies foreign policy, has two different schools, the realists and the idealists. Henry Kissinger, for instance, was a realist. The idealists are those who believe that America, the United States, is founded on a set of great ideas. For instance, democracy. 50% say it's not a democracy, but it's a great idea. It's formulated on the idea of free markets. It's actually not true. Alexander Hamilton was a follower of Friedrich List, believed in protectionism, but that's their vision of what the idea is, free markets, democracy, and so on. And that the United States can use allopathic uses of force, such as against Iraq, massive bombardment, shock and awe, destroy the country and convert it into a US paradise, free markets, democracy, and so on. So one section thought you can use allopathic uses of violence, huge uses of violence, and you can create a country into the image of the United States. The other section of the idealists believe you should use homeopathic doses of violence, whether through sanctions or through small bombings or assassinations and so on, and get rid of the forces arrayed against you, and then create a country in the image of the United States. So what united the various flanks of the idealists was that you can create the world to look like the United States. That was effectively the policy from 1991, the Clinton administration, to the end of the Biden administration. The difference of opinion was tactical. Some people who were called hawks believed you can use major force to conduct this idealist goal. And then there were the so-called doves who believed you could use less force to make other countries look like the United States. That was the idealist perspective, and they dominated US foreign policy from 1991 till the end of the Biden administration. Trump has actually reverted to the realists. And I'm going to describe two realist people for you, because one of them is actually very important to the AUKUS conversation. He's brought back a number of realists. Before he came into office, he attacked John Bolton publicly. He said John Bolton is a nutcase. He believes that you can go in there and bomb countries and change their governments, and it succeeds. And he said, the reason I liked John Bolton in the first administration was when I brought him with me to meetings, he would scare the shit out of everybody in the meeting. So that's Trump's dismissal of the idealists. And he brings in the realists. Some of these realists actually come from a pseudo-left background, like Tulsi Gabbard, who's his director of national intelligence. Pseudo-left because she was never a left-wing person, but she was, after a fashion, very much against the interventionist wars of the United States, because she didn't believe those wars were good for the United States. And this is very important. That's why these are pseudo-left people. They agreed with the left that interventionist wars are bad, but they agreed for reasons that were completely different from a left-wing reason. We think wars are bad because wars perpetuate the structure of imperialism. And we are anti-imperialists, so we are against these wars. She was against the war because she felt it didn't enhance US power. In fact, it was bad for US imperialism. So that's why they are pseudo-leftists. A little confusion. People say, well, wasn't Tulsi Gabbard a person of the left? Never a leftist. She was against interventionist wars, but for imperialist reasons. You can actually oppose an imperialist war for imperialist reasons, and she's a good example of that. Okay, here are two of the people within the Trump administration who you probably have never heard of, but are pretty influential in the production of his foreign policy. One is Michael DeMeo, very interesting man. He runs, he's part of the team running West Asian policy. Michael DeMeo, when he was being questioned by the US Senate to approve his appointment, was asked a question about Iran's nuclear program. And his answer was so interesting. I haven't watched these hearings in many years because they're so dull. They say the same things, you know. But these guys were quite interesting because they are producing a departure from, 50 years of foreign policy. It's a big departure. Michael DeMeo said that, well, listen, if Iran actually does get nuclear weapons, it's no problem for the United States. It doesn't impact the US government. Because Iran would never dare to attack the US government, with or without nuclear weapons. It would never dare. The US would obliterate Iran. And now with Hezbollah weakened, with Hamas weakened, with the Yemenis to be weakened soon, with the Syrian government gone, Iran has no forward policy, no way to attack Israel if it is attacked. So Iran having nuclear weapons is not a problem. This is a very interesting realist calculation. That a realist here says, if this country has nuclear weapons, it's of no consequence to us. Just as if North Korea has nuclear weapons. Doesn't matter. They will never dare to attack the United States. So why should we spend hundreds of billions of dollars trying to prevent them from getting something which is of absolutely no concern to us? Wow. It's a big departure from US foreign policy. That was Michael DeMeo. And more interesting and important for you is the other appointment. He's number 3 in the US Defense Department. But in fact, is probably one of the smartest people in the Defense Department. Certainly smarter than Hegseth, who's the Defense Secretary, who's an idiot, But this guy's name is Elbridge Colby, known to his friends as Bridge, because he comes from that New England aristocracy. Elbridge. I mean, who names their kid Elbridge? Yeah, and then calls him Bridge. Hey, Bridge, are we playing polo today or whatever? Elbridge Colby is the grandson of William Colby, who was the head of the CIA in the 1980s. And those of you who remember Iran, Contra, and so on may remember the name William Colby. Bridge is very interesting. He wrote a book for Yale University Press. I think it was published early last year, which is a fascinating defense of the realist perspective in general. I'm going to share with you a couple of his thoughts on Ukraine and then China, and then directly 3 weeks ago, his thoughts on AUKUS, because this will help you understand the Trump administration's perspective. And everything he says is extremely rational. So it's not about some crazy, irrational Trump idea. I think that's really a stupid way to approach this. We have to understand the world from the facts, not from our own crazy left-wing idealism. We need a little bit of left-wing realism, comrades. Okay, there's a little too much left-wing idealism in the international left. Okay, we need to have a little more hard-boiled, realistic perspective on the world. And I'm afraid there's also a little too much left-wing moralism, which goes beyond the facts. I think there needs to be more attention to the facts in our time, rather than, to want to be, have a better position than the next person on Twitter and so on. Adherence to the facts, which was Lenin's mandate to us. Lenin sitting up there toward the back, looking so good, Abdullah. So good, as the Lenin of our moment. Yeah, looking so good. Okay. Here's what Colby understands. Colby says Ukraine is a useless war because Ukraine has absolutely no advantage to the United States. Absolutely useless war. The Russians need to shut the war down. If they're going to have to keep the eastern sections, keep the eastern sections. If they want to keep Crimea, keep Crimea. Ukraine has to calm down. There is no winnable agenda here. The West can't win against Russia. What do we want? As Trump yelled at Zelensky, do you want to start World War III? What's the end game? You know, the French can't fight themselves. You know, what's Britain going to assemble? Dad's army? I mean, none of the kids in Britain, heavily tattooed and pierced, are going to want to go and fight in some godforsaken hellhole in order on Keir Starmer's, you know. I mean, how many people join the military unless compelled to for class purposes? Which middle-class kid is going to sign up to fight for Keir Starmer or for Emmanuel Macron? You know, Germany apparently has 3 days of fighting ability. 3 days. You know, these guys talk a big game, but without the US umbrella, without US resupply, they are nothing. So Colby says, you guys are nothing without us. And we're not going to help you because we are not interested in this war. It is a distraction. Russia is not an existential threat to the United States, he said. He said Russia is merely, and he's completely correct, is merely a commodity exporter. It's not a threat to the US. They export commodities. They export natural gas and oil. So what? So does so many countries. So does the United States. It's not a threat to the US. Stop this war. It's garbage. Plus, within the racist section of the Trump administration, the hardcore white supremacists, they have an idea that Russia, in fact, is peopled by whites, even though Slavs, and peopled by whites who are Christians, even though Orthodox, and they hate homosexuals as much as the right wing in the United States, and they hate the woke agenda of transgender, this, that, and the other, and that right wing in Russia can be peeled off from Russia's alliance with China, and that the United States can find common cause with these people against the real threat, which is China. I'm coming back to that later. So Colby says, and quite correctly, that Russia is not a threat. I agree with him. Russia can't threaten anybody. Yeltsin destroyed that country from 1991 till Putin in 2007 said we're renationalizing oil and natural gas. They just gave everything away on the orders of the United States. In 1996, Yeltsin lost the election. The KPRF, the communists, won the election. The United States intervened to make sure Putin was re-elected. Don't talk to me about this. This was a cover story in Time magazine. Time magazine had a cover story, how the Americans intervened to make sure the KPRF, that Zyuganov didn't become the president of Russia in 96. The Russian communists could have come back in 1996, democratically elected, because Yeltsin was such shit from 91 to 96, drunk, falling off stage, you know, all of that. Putin renationalizes oil and natural gas, but that's not a big deal. This country is not a threat to the US. That's what Colby says, number one. So this whole overture to Russia to end the war in Ukraine isn't some Russian scheme cocked up by some money paid or some tape that, I don't know, sex tape, Trump pissing on somebody. You know, it's not that. They have an argument which actually makes sense to me. If you're the United States, it's not worthwhile to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on an unwinnable, stupid war. Make a deal, stop the damn war. That's the perspective. I agree with them. Yes, I said this somewhere and somebody said, oh, so now you're a Trump supporter. No, idiot. I think the war is stupid. Just because you agree on something, I mean, I'm sure he eats breakfast, so do I. That doesn't make me a Trump supporter. That's dumb, yeah? I think he's a right-wing fascist. But he's right on this, and Colby has an argument for it. Then Colby turns around and says the real threat is China. And that's where things get interesting. Because this administration, realistically and correctly, I agree with them, has figured out that China is the actual threat to the United States. But what is the nature of the Chinese threat? And this is what the Australians don't understand. Or what, I don't mean you, I mean them, Albanese and down that section. Or at least they're not talking about it in public, yeah? When I say, they may understand it in a secret briefing, but what they're telling you is garbage. In fact, interestingly, and here's the statistic, I published this a few weeks ago in a tricontinental newsletter, and you can subscribe to the newsletters online, thetricontinental.org. This newsletter referred to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, established by the Australian government in 2001, funded by the Australian military. It's a think tank, yeah? They released a report late last year, okay? They keep a record of 64 critical technologies. 64 critical technologies, okay? All kinds of things, high performance computing, quantum sensors, space launch technology, and so on. Okay, doesn't matter. 64 technologies, okay? Between 2003 and 2007, United States led in these 64 technologies, yeah? In 60 of 64. So the overwhelming advantage. This is 2003 to 2007. The Chinese led in 3 of them. So 60 out of 64, 2003 to 2007. Between 2019 and 2023, or roughly, 20 years later, roughly, the US led in only 7 of them. So from 60 to 7. And the Chinese now lead in 57. From just a tiny number to almost all of them, and are growing technologically. What I saw in Shenyang, for instance, was amazing. I mean, there is stuff there technologically that they're doing, which is science fiction. The metro train is so fast. I mean, you have never seen the Jetsons or these 1960s science fiction television shows, like where the train just goes from one building to the next. That's exactly what it's like. It's so fast. The high-speed rail from Beijing to Shanghai is like 4 hours. Last time I was here, I was in Canberra, and I said how stupid it was. Remember, Nick? We had to take the bus from Sydney to Canberra, the biggest city to the capital. It's the stupidest thing I've done in years. We took the bus. There's no train, no high-speed rail. It would have been like 40-minute journey. Boom, Chinese train, yeah? Amazing. Canberra to Melbourne. Imagine I'd come here and I'd watch the test in Melbourne, go up to Brisbane, watch the next test, third test in Sydney, and then maybe fly to Perth. And then write about it in The Guardian, which, needs to really publish all my cricket columns. Publishing one column is not enough, yeah? The last column was called The Yorkers of Shamar Joseph, about how this young guy from Guyana destroyed Australia. And the Australians were like, oh my God, he got Travis Head was out for a duck both innings. Second time, he didn't even see the ball. He later said he didn't see the ball coming. Shamar Joseph's so amazing. If there was high-speed rail, you would have a democratic country, more democratic feeling. And let me explain this quickly. In China, during the Spring Festival is the largest internal mass migration in history. Okay, 100 million people plus move to go see their families for the spring. With high-speed rail, even lowered income people can go home because it's affordable. And they can go home in 6 hours, 7 hours, so on, where it would have otherwise taken 5 days with a steam locomotive. So the Chinese are making these extraordinary advances. That was the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, funded by the Australian military. In other words, the Australian government knows that China has an enormous technological advantage over the United States. And that's an enormous threat to the US. The US economy relies on rent-seeking firms that have a technological advantage over firms everywhere else in the world. But these rent-seeking firms no longer have those technical advantages. Apple has very few technical advantages over Huawei. Okay, most engineering that is happening now, whether it's with magnets or with, like computerization and so on, the advantage is with Chinese firms. And many of them are state-owned enterprises. And this is a serious threat to the US economy. When Obama started the pivot to Asia, they began to understand the emergence of the threat in 2011. And then by the time Trump came in his first term, it was very clear that this was a serious problem. And Trump started the tariff and trade war against China. The banning of Huawei deepens. Pressure on the Europeans not to use Huawei. Pressure on Australia, New Zealand not to use Huawei. They were using imperialist pressure, extra economic force, to damage the Chinese economy, preventing China from importing chips from Taiwan, preventing China from importing other materials necessary for the Chinese high-tech development, preventing China from buying technology from Japan, and so on. They wanted to fatally damage China's rise technologically. Xi Jinping, at the same time, President of China, gave a speech saying China is moving from this generation of industry to advancing what he called new quality productive forces. This is the new word in China. This phrase is the new phrase. It's everywhere. It's used everywhere. You talk to low-level officials, mid-level officials, they all talk about enhancing new quality productive forces. Went into a party office of the Chinese Communist Party in a small town in Hebei province. And in this province, in this party office, there were these giant ATM-type kiosks where the peasantry, it's a rural area, can come in, put their ID number in, and they can print out land documents. They don't have to go online or anything. It's done in this kiosk. This kiosk prints legal land documents. These are advancing the new quality productive forces. You don't want a farmer to have to go to a big city, spend the whole day. You have to hire somebody to help you. Which desk shall I go to? Who do I need to bribe? All of that is gone. They want to use technology to basically ease quality of life for people. New quality productive. I thought, my God, imagine if this machine was in Sydney. Like for you to get government legal documents at an ATM machine. I don't believe in Luddism. If machines help make life easier, let people have more leisure. I don't believe that if a machine displaces your job, it's bad for you. What's bad for you is we have a crap distribution of the benefits of mechanization. We want to work 4-hour days, so we have more leisure, more time to fight to change the world, to have these kind of debates, discussions. People don't come to these because they have long work days, they're tired, there's no daycare, they have, some problem at home, an elderly family member needs them. There's no social support. It's difficult to get to political meetings. It's difficult to politicize people because the structure of society is broken. These countries don't have a society anymore. They have people living in families trying to survive. Social bonds are totally broken. The Chinese Revolution is trying to revive society. The less time people spend doing crap things like going to get some deed, the more time they can spend at local meetings, have discussions and so on, of which there is a lot. Every time I spoke anywhere in China, there would be huge numbers of people coming. Peasants and others would come to listen to what's happening in different parts of the world. Why? Because they have the time for it. Time is what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for wages. The goal of building socialism isn't to have higher wages. That's the goal of capitalism. In socialism, we fight for time. We fight to control our time. We fight to build a society. We want social bonds to be strengthened. We want much more leisure time to think and breathe and so on. And so that is the kind of thing that they are doing there, which is a direct existential threat to the United States. Yeah, 5 minutes more. China is a threat. China is a threat. It's a threat to the US political economy. But rather than deal with that threat economically, in other words, use more of their own savings to build the new productive forces in the US, which they can't do. Biden couldn't pass an infrastructure bill in the US. Rather than contest the Chinese economically, produce idea boards from American companies, they want to use military force to subordinate the Chinese and prevent them from development. And the Chinese see this as the third opium war. This is the third opium war. This is an attempt by the United States to bring China back into the century of humiliation. They will not surrender. They will continue to develop their new productive forces, and they will defend themselves. They will defend themselves. They are not going to surrender. There is no Gorbachev in China. United States has looked for a long time for a Gorbachev in Beijing. They are not going to show up. They don't exist there. The party is extremely careful about all that nonsense. It's not going to happen. Australia is making a fatal error. Neither is the economic and technological rise of Australia hampered or hindered by Chinese technological and economic rise, because Australia is not building the new quality productive forces. Face it, guys. You don't have Australian apps that are anything other than shadow apps coming from elsewhere. What is the Australian TikTok? Is there an Australian TikTok? Is there an Australian drive share app? Is there an Australian pay app? I mean, there are no technological breakthroughs, or few technological breakthroughs coming from your development is basically like Russia's development. You are a seller of commodities, and that too primary commodities. That's what Australia is. That's what it has been, and that's what China is not a threat to that. China, in fact, is your largest market. Secondly, China is not a military threat to Australia. They have never indicated any interest in attacking Australia. So it is sort of stupid to actually spend any money on defense which is geared towards a so-called Chinese threat. You want to go to 2% of your GDP or 2.02%, as Albanese has said, that's up to you. But don't make the calculation based on an invasion by the Chinese. Now there's another number being floated about. Richard Marles, your fabulous defense secretary, wants to go to 2.4% of GDP by 2033, $100 billion more. That's actually 1/3 of the conservative price for AUKUS. There was a conversation about 5% of GDP. Now, interestingly, this is the same conversation in Europe. Australia needs to defend itself because the US is no longer reliable. But I want you to start a conversation in your country. Defend itself from whom? Who is your biggest threat? The biggest threat to Australia are the mining companies. The biggest threat to Australia is your own bourgeoisie. The biggest threat to Australia is not China. Why would a country that benefits from trade with Australia attack Australia? Why do Australian military ships need to patrol waters which are carrying ships with goods from China and back? Why would the Chinese attack ships coming to China with Australian goods or ships coming from China to Australia with Chinese goods? It is totally bloody illogical. And yet, stupid Australian military ships join the United States in freedom of navigation operations. Why? That discussion needs to be had in this country. This is not just about AUKUS. This is not just about 2.02 or 2.3% of GDP. This is about you being a subordinate ally of the United States, a slavish ally of the United States. This is you copying all the contradictions of European foreign policy. Has there ever been an Australian foreign policy? In fact, is there really something called Australia? Thanks a lot. Knees are hurting. Okay. We'll do some questions for what? 20 minutes? 20 minutes?
You want to run it or do you want me to run it?
Well, I can run it.
Okay.
I'll run it because I might recognize some scoundrels and prevent them from asking questions, you know.
Just one, can you hear me? At all these functions, please keep your question short and to the point.
If you want. Because, you know, I mean, yeah, it's one of those things. It comes actually, Dennis, in a way from a lack of social spaces. If we had like these events every day, people wouldn't feel so like nobody listens to me. You know, it comes from partly the deterioration of society. Like, you know, you probably have branch meetings. When people join a political organization, you get to go to your branch meeting, you get to talk to each other. I highly recommend, if those of you who are not part of an organization, there are at least 3 organizations in this room. There's Red Spark, there's the Communist Party of Australia, there's Socialist Alliance, Socialist Alliance. You should join an organization. It's the best place to finesse your thinking, in fact. Also to participate in struggle. Yeah, it's the best place. Finesse your thinking. And also you can finesse your questions there. Yeah, you can perfect the art of questions. Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm nervous. Thank you very much, Vijay. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. And yeah,
let's take 3 at a time, should we? Or yeah, okay.
So, I mean,
what's your name?
My name is Brian.
Brian.
I agreed with everything you said. I thought it was all brilliant. But the thing is, you know, one of our former prime ministers referred to Australia as an outpost of the Anglosphere. You know, yeah. So Tony Abbott, right? And I just wonder, right? Like, I think China does pose a kind of existential threat, and I think China poses an existential threat to the idea of white supremacy. And there's this first, you know, there's this devil's pact, right? This first-hand bargain where I think for a decent segment of the society, a slavish relationship to the United States, subjection to American imperialism, seems less frightening and more familiar than a world in which non-white people are no longer in a subordinate position. And I'm really curious about what you make of that.
Super reflection, Brian. Super reflection. Let's go to Rachel, and then the gentleman behind you in the check shirt, and then we come back to you for the second round. Yeah.
Thanks, Vijay. What's your assessment of the strength of the anti-imperialist movement through the Palestine uprising, and also the strength of the left, the German elections, the Trump elections, and are we scared of polarization or not? That is the socialist left.
Yeah, great. And the gentleman back there, sorry to have you run around. What's your name?
Patrick.
Patrick is running around, yeah. I'm sort of going here, there.
Hi, Vijay. My name is Richard. Just the funny thing is I was born in Beijing and I grew up near Renmin University. So my aunt actually teaches law there until very recently. So the question I was going to ask is that in Australia, among the left groups, one of our biggest left group, which isn't here, they have this position that it's neither Washington or Moscow or Beijing. But I can't help but notice that this type of mentality puts them in a position where they pits the very real documented atrocities and imperialism of the United States versus theoretical ones the Americans accuse China of. For instance, this bullshit called social credit, like that, which has been dismissed by many actual researchers, even from the US government, yet it's still being spewed out by in the social media and even amongst many leftists. I just want to say, how should leftists address this type of mentality, this false balance? Thank you.
Wow, what's great is there's actually a nice, convergence in the questions. Brian, yes. Okay, it's true. I mean, I mentioned it parenthetically, the colonial blah, blah, blah. But I think there's something to that. I think there's a little anxiety. And it goes to Richard's question. Like, these countries must be bad. They must be doing bad things. Like the United States can bomb Iraq, kill million-plus people, have Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the black sites in Eastern Europe, but somehow Tony Blair is just okay, George W. Bush is okay, you don't need to send them. And it's weird because it's not like I like Rodrigo Duterte. Rodrigo Duterte went after the drug dealers with vengeance, yeah? But he didn't kill as many people as Bush killed in Iraq. And he's just taken to the Hague, yeah? Trump's ally in El Salvador, current ally, Bukele, is doing almost exactly what Duterte is doing. It's where the US is exporting prisoners to Bukele's jail and paying El Salvador for those prisoners to be held there. Brutal policies by Bukele, no jail for him, US ally. They do have this, the powers that be, they push this idea that the darker people of the world are more sinister. The Chinese are more sinister. The old yellow peril ideas. Can't understand the Chinese, they look alike, and they have, they're hiding something. They're not straight with you, yeah? If the Chinese say, we don't want war, it means they want war. Because they are deceitful people. It's like a game of Go. I read a book once where a guy had a parenthesis to explain the rules of Go, this ancient game, in order to understand how the Chinese think. And that's ridiculous because, if you want to understand how Chinese people think, well, go and talk to at least 200 million to get a sampling, yeah? Because people have all kinds of attitudes and ideas. But there is this idea that, they must be doing bad things. Like what they're doing in Xinjiang is so bad and they're not telling anybody. And those who have been to Xinjiang and walked around Urumqi and visited mosques and things like that are lying because they are paid informants of the Chinese government. Because somewhere hidden from those who are taken on Potemkin village tours are really bad things. You see, meanwhile, Guantanamo still exists. And we know what they're doing there. But the yellow people must be doing something really bad. This is 18th and 19th century racism. Yeah, they're sinister. It's all the old tropes of the sinister Oriental. It's all the old tropes. It's so blatantly offensive. Xi Jinping, is a dictator. What makes Xi a dictator? What makes him a dictator? Let's say he even is able to get another term. Yeah? If Trump gets another term, the liberals will call him a dictator, but half the population in the US will celebrate. What makes somebody a dictator? It's interesting. Just before leaving China, I had lunch with a professor from Fudan University, Professor Meng Jie, who teaches economics. And I was asking him about financing in China. Like, how does it work? I needed to understand how local authorities raise finance. So he said, well, interestingly, yes, it's true, the municipality raises the first taxes, then the district, then there's some federal taxation. Taxation goes up. But a lot of the tax is held by the municipality and the province. Because the principal governance of China takes place at the urban and the provincial level. So if you talk to a provincial level official, they will say, if it's not forbidden to do something by the central government, we can do it. We can innovate. If the central government forbids it, for instance, opening up finance, we can't do that. And if you look at it, the central government actually doesn't forbid a whole lot of things. It doesn't. Because they have to give latitude to the provinces. So how is that a dictatorship? That might be a democracy you don't understand, but it's not the same as a dictatorship. It's its own thing. It's their own kind of democracy. Majority of Chinese people seem to be okay with it. Most of those who are yelling and screaming about China being horrible haven't lived in China for 150 years. They've been part of the long-term Chinese diaspora in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and so on. Or they left China in the 1970s. They turned their back and went away. So, okay, you say people in China can't speak out because it's authoritarian. That's a weird thing. Okay, because people in China speak out all the time. I did tons of events where people are critical of things and so on. It happens all the time. But people are respectful. It's a different world. And it's not just China. A lot of old world countries, when an elder is on the stage, people just don't stand up and say, you're an asshole. People don't talk like that. Yeah, that's how we talk. We are unruly people. Yeah? But imagine if you go to, I don't know, Uganda, and somebody, a professor is on the stage, you can't just yell and scream at them. I mean, that's just not the way. These are old countries with old established traditions. It's not authoritarian, it's dumb, yeah? So I think some of this anxiety about these barbarians taking over the world is in play. It is in play. You know, how can the barbarians have authority in the world? Only 100 years ago, Lord John Maynard Keynes, when the Bretton Woods institutions were being set up in 1944, said that the formerly colonial countries shouldn't be allowed to attend because he said, if they attend, our conference will become a monkey house. That was Lord John Maynard Keynes. Our conference will become a monkey house. Yeah, if you read Richard Nixon's statements, you know, he uses much more colorful language to refer to people. We don't want the Africans because they are fill in the blank. Yeah, direct statement. Trump is pretty blunt and direct. Yeah, liberals sometimes like to hold their tongue and be dance around, but Trump was direct. I mean, look, that's to you, Richard and Brian. I mean, Rachel, the polarization of the left. Firstly, there's a big difference in the left in different parts of the world, the problems the left is facing. I think in Europe and in the settler colonies, one of the main issues comes back to Brian's point about the white supremacy of their countries, and that is linked to immigration. You know, you can't go around destroying the world and then creating economies where you're paying the working class so little. You can't expect that these two things aren't going to produce a working class from a bombed country, because your own citizens are not going to clean toilets and pick strawberries and so on. They are used to now a middle-class life thanks to social welfare policies and so on. Families who have a house don't want their kids to go and become janitors. You know, they may allow them to own a janitorial service company, which has a whole bunch of migrants in a van that this person drives around and tells them, go out and clean the toilet. You see that in Australia as well. This is the immigration crisis. It's a crisis of war abroad and rising expectations at home, which these countries can't meet anymore. Okay, so the left has a problem because the left comes out there and says open borders. And, you know, that loses you a lot of people in these countries because it's not actually a clear political analysis. It's an emotional, moral approach. So in Europe, the left in many countries can't appeal to the working class anymore. Similarly in the US, the right has taken over. You know, Clara Zetkin in 1923 wrote a terrific essay about the early rise of fascism. She said the fascists have entered the consciousness of the working class. They have built a mass movement within the working class. It's not that they've deluded the working class. That was not her analysis, not the analysis of the Comintern in the early years. You know, it was Zetkin, it was Gramsci, it was Togliatti, it was Slav from Hungary, it was Dimitrov in 1935. These people all understood that fascism wasn't just a dictatorship. It built mass movements of the working class. And we are not able to create an argument about immigration that is sophisticated enough not to be inhumane and at the same time not to completely dismiss the anxieties of people born in a country can't find a job. Yeah, we just don't have the language for it, or our language is too complicated. Like, you know, all the things I said, it's too complicated. Wars over there, you don't want to work cleaning toilets. It again sounds like an attack. You know, if only you went and cleaned toilets, you'd get a job. That's not a way to reach people. That's a dismissal. It's a bourgeois dismissal of people's worries. In Germany, the Bundeswageneck tried something interesting. They tried to enter from the left into the immigration debate by making the argument that we should stop bombing your countries, then you don't have to come here. And they were accused by other parts of the left as being right-wing, social conservatives, anti-immigrant, and so on. Unhelpful. Part of it is Sarah Wagenknecht herself made the argument poorly. She sounded like she was saying, go back home. But what she was really saying is, do you really want to live in Germany in a as a third-class citizen? Yeah, do you really want to come to Australia and make beds, in a hotel or whatever, Is that the highest aspiration for you? Drive Uber or something? Is that what you want? If we didn't bomb your country, you wouldn't come here. But I don't think we've found the way to talk about that. And basically, this is a great example of the left eating itself, because, we do this all the time. Minor differences within the left always become the major point of contention. It confuses the working class to see the left eating itself on a minor disagreement. Like Ukraine. For God's sake, how did Ukraine become the point of division for the Australian left, European left, US left, and so on, at a time when there are so many other issues to unite you? Why is that a point of complete division and rupture? When I came here last time, I was forbidden to speak at the Palestine rally in Melbourne because they said he's a denier of the Uyghur genocide. So he shouldn't be allowed to speak at the Palestine demonstration in Melbourne. I still went for the demonstration. I marched in the demo, enjoyed it thoroughly, found the energy very good. But what is that? How does that make sense? That becomes the point of division. It's moralistic politics. Somebody says, I disagree with him, he's a genocide denier. And others says, well, in solidarity with our comrade, in allyship, I hate that word. In allyship, what word is a liberal NGO word? In allyship with my comrade, I'm going to, there's no struggling with your comrade. Whatever somebody says, I don't like this, okay, we agree with you. Because you are here and struggle with us. So we'll just dismiss something, we don't know anything about. And we don't give the person a chance to talk about it. So, nobody asked me, like, what's your actual position on the Uyghur genocide? Why? But they just said, no, he can't speak here. That we're eating us. I'm not saying I would have made a big difference, okay? I'm not saying that. But on the other hand, it's dumb. It's just a small example of the dumbness.
好，维杰·普拉萨德的这段信息量十足、观点犀利的演讲，我们就看到这里。他用深厚的学识和犀利的语言，呈现出一幅完全不同于西方媒体的话语图景。他系统反驳了西方关于中国民主和人权的刻板印象，用数据和事实说明中国道路的独特性和广泛的民意支持。他对澳大利亚等国盲目追随美国、缺乏外交独立的批评也是一针见血。此外，他对美国当前面临的科技落差、社会撕裂以及帝国黄昏的焦虑心理也给出了深入的剖析。尤其是他在回应观众关于白人至上和澳洲对美屈从这些尖锐提问时，更是直指问题的本质，点破了一些西方社会根深蒂固的文化焦虑和种族焦虑。可以说，普拉萨德作为来自全球南方的左翼知识分子，展现了强烈的批判精神和独立思考。他所带来的视角，对我们理解今天这个不断变化的世界，具有重要的价值。今天的内容就分享到这里，感谢大家收看，我们下次再见。